Hey everyone, it's George Couros, another episode of the Innovator's Mindset podcast. I'm really glad you could join me today. I usually try to get this podcast out on a Sunday, but I've been traveling a little bit and back in Edmonton, Alberta, and it's a lot of snow on the ground, but hey, that's part of being Canadian. So it's not my favorite time of the year, but I do appreciate the snow, especially more as I kind of, as I get older and maybe get a little snow in the beard. Um, and I've kind of taken a little bit of a social media break. I've not been tweeting as much, sharing very little about education, and I'll share stuff here and there. I like to read quite a bit. And I guess when I say that I've taken a little bit of a social media break, I think I've kind of taken a break from sharing all the time in the sense that I'm still on social media, still reading, trying to keep up with educator, articles, things that people are sharing and writing about or posting online. Because I always like this kind of take this time just to kind of sit back, and I'm really thoughtful of how much I consume and what I do. And I think for me, I think this is a really important message that we have to have, not only for adults, but for our students as well. We've talked about this shift of moving school to, from consumption to creation. And I think that's really important, but I think that we have to understand that consumption is actually really important to creation. And years ago, I talked about this idea of school versus learning. And I asked the question like, how do our students see school and how do they see learning? And is there a connection between the two? And it's meant to be a conversational image when I share it. It's not meant to be like an either or, but it's meant to say like, what do we focus on? What is the end goal of school? And on one column, you can see there's the school talking about school is about consuming and learning is about creating. But the idea is that really we have to have this meaningful consumption to actually do meaningful creation. I think that's really important. And so every year I try to kind of just take some time to sit back and just read and think about this, because I find sometimes that I kind of get lost in my own thoughts. If I'm just sharing too much, I'm not reading other stuff. And I also think about like, what is some of the stuff that's kind of stood the test of time. So like I reread books that, are popular years ago. Like I like to read new stuff too, but I also always think about why is a book relevant that was written, for example, in the 1930s, things like that. And what are the consistent messages? And one of my favorite books that I've talked about quite often is by Dale Carnegie. It's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I think it was written in the 1930s. I don't know the exact date, and maybe I'm off there too. But he talks about like how we connect with people. And I think, especially in educational leadership, any type of leadership, to be honest with you, I actually even think, if you're still a teacher in the classroom, it's a really interesting book to think about how we connect with people. And there's so many like really great quotes. And one of my favorites is this one. So if you aspire to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. To be interesting, be interested. Ask questions that other persons will enjoy answering. Encourage them to talk about themselves and their accomplishments. And I think about that a lot too. And I've had a really big focus probably the last 10 to 15 years on leadership and why it's so important. And I also think that when we talk about leadership, we don't talk about the importance of following. For example, a great leader in a school will know when to step aside to let other people take charge, and they'll learn to learn from them, right? And they'll put people in those positions. And that old adage is that great leaders don't develop great followers; they develop more great leaders. And I think it's the notion that when we know people have skills and gifts to contribute, even if we're the formal leader of an organization, it's really important to ensure that we put those people in the forefront and give them the opportunity to lead, because not only does it make our organization better, it makes us better too. And this idea of being a good listener is something that I think about, but I also think about just being thoughtful of not only what I say, but how often I talk. And I know that sounds weird. And so I was thinking about this. I was thinking about when I used to ref basketball, and I'll tell you, being a basketball referee for I think it was probably like 5 to 8 years or something like that. I learned a lot about working with people. I actually ref basketball while I was an administrator, and it was interesting because you'd have people yelling at you, at the basketball court, and then you have that happening when you are, in school during the day too. So it was easier to be yelled at while you're not running. So I felt like it just, you deal with conflict on the fly. You have to be quick in how you deal with it. And I learned a lot. And I feel that my reffing experience really helped me, not only as an administrator, but as an educator as well. And I remember, and I was thinking about these two coaches. And what we would do as referees, we would have little meetings before games and we talk about, like, hey, let's talk about these teams, let's talk about these coaches. What are some things that we want to think about? And I remember two distinct coaches, and it wasn't the same game, but just thinking about the difference. And one used to basically yell at the refs nonstop. It was just all the time. And he would just yell and yell and yell and yell and yell and yell. And he wouldn't necessarily, cross a line, but he'd push all game. And he wouldn't say anything overly rude, but he would just, like I said, talk all of the time. And what I noticed is that you just ignored him. And the reason why you ignored him is because he just was going off all day. If you listen to him, you would believe everything you did was wrong the entire game, which is not true. And I'm not saying that referees are infallible. Of course they are, just like coaches, just like basketball players. But it was always about this person wanting you to do what was in the best benefit of his team, his coaching, etc. And so I remember that. I remember how easily it was to tune that person out who just yelled the entire time. And then I also remember another conversation we were having, a pregame, talking about this coach. And this was a coach at the college level. And the higher levels you get up, reffing, the more intense it becomes. And so you're always worried about, a loud coach, or who's going to yell at you as a referee the entire time. And I remember my partner knew this coach. And he told me, he said, look, this coach doesn't say much. He doesn't really talk at all. Doesn't say anything. But if he does say something, listen, because he's very thoughtful of when he interjects. And if he says something, he probably has a point. And I always think about that. I always think about how you would never really hear from the coach, but when you did, there's something really valid there. And I think about that in what I share. I think about that, how often I share, maybe even as well. And just kind of, how sometimes we always say like the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I don't know if that's always true. And I don't know if that's right. I know that sometimes when we pick and choose when we speak, it's interesting that, we might get more attention because there's more thought into it. And I just think about that, in education and why that matters. And I've been thinking a lot about, obviously, as everybody in the world, COVID, its impact on schools, what it's done. And there are a lot of conversations that happen and I've had, and you can see a lot of teachers have really, well, I shouldn't say a lot, I say like the majority have really stepped up to do amazing things, even in the hardest of times. And when I say amazing, I'm saying like, that's relative. I mean, amazing for the situation, how hard it is, how they're connecting, and how much I appreciate that. But what I've noticed is that some of the administrators I talk to will share little stories about, I have this teacher who, was so against technology forever. And now they're all over it. They're doing it. And it's amazing to actually watch. Think about that quite a bit, because did we believe that teacher because they weren't doing what we thought they should be at a certain time? Did we believe they were bad? You know, and maybe they've been great the entire time, but maybe they never saw the relevance of using technology. But now, obviously, there's huge relevance because the teachers that I know that are really great, they always know the importance of connecting and building relationships. And when technology is your only option, as schools are hybrid, remote, etc., then those great teachers will see the value and they'll see the connecting. And so the conversation I think that has to, that I've been having with a lot of leaders is what happened during COVID that actually convinced somebody to try something different that we couldn't do before, and understanding that they saw the need for it. But how do we do this? Instead of thinking like, hey, these people don't embrace this, my staff doesn't embrace this teacher doesn't embrace this. It's always about looking inward and saying, how come I'm not being effective in getting them to see value? And that's a shift, and it's a humbling shift, I think, for many, because the idea is that you can't get people to change their ideas based on what you say, right? You can only create conditions where change is more likely to happen. And I've always talked about this idea of how do you move people from their point A to their point B? And ultimately, you have to think about what is their point A? You have to figure that out. You have to identify what that is. And really, that takes listening. And I wrote this blog years ago talking about the idea of, you have to convince me. When I used to write my blog posts and really think about my own leadership, I think I would put people in a situation where I would say things like, if you're not doing this, you're going to become irrelevant, right? And pressuring them, and kind of the idea of that, like, I know the way, and if you're not seeing it, it's because you don't want to, etc. But what I've started to, I guess, what I've really come to embrace is that I know a lot of people who maybe don't embrace some of the things that I do have tremendous value, and they do incredible things, even though they don't do exactly the same things that I do. And I've been guilty of saying like, hey, if you're not on Twitter, you're irrelevant, kind of things like that. And really thinking about, yeah, that's not, there's a lot of people connecting in so many different spaces. Why does it have to be this one? Or, there's different thoughts when you think about all these things, and just trying to learn from people. So when I talked about this idea of convincing me, I think it was about, instead of me trying to push my ideas down your throat and maybe make you feel guilty for not sharing them, my perspectives on teaching and learning, maybe I need to listen more. Maybe I need to kind of step back and think about that. And I think that, going back to the idea of like followership as a leader, there's an opportunity to learn. And I wrote this in the blog, and I said, so instead of you trying to convince them why change is necessary, why not give them a chance to assure you that standing still is crucial? If they are set on it, there must be some reasoning, so let them talk. I've been working on this lately and has made a difference in my own perspective and thinking. Listening is helpful to both parties. Maybe you are wrong and they have valid points. Perhaps you're on the right track, but you find some common ground that you can build on. Or maybe figure out that neither party is going to move and you don't spend your time spinning your wheels in the same spot. This is not about proving who is right and who is wrong, but finding places where we can work together to help improve education for all learners. And that idea is really, how do I listen? How do I find that point A? How do I find this? And maybe sometimes when we do that listening, with sometimes, let's be honest, Covey talks this, seek first to understand before being understood. Sometimes when we have those, when we truly listen and hear what other people are saying, maybe we're giving an opportunity for us to maybe change our position that, hey, you know what, maybe the change that I'm talking about isn't that great. Maybe the change that I'm talking about isn't helpful. Maybe they're right in this situation and I need to grow. I need to think differently about what this looks like, as opposed to going in there with the intent to change someone's mind, to, manipulate them to your ideas. And I think, it's really important in education, obviously, to constantly progress, move forward, and grow. But I think a lot of times we think that's what other people should do, not necessarily ourselves. And so I've been really thinking about this idea, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this and maybe some of the strategies that you have and some of the ways that you listen, to understand, to hear. So I would love for you to share in the comment. We're going to be highlighting people's comments in future YouTube videos. So I'd love to hear from you as well. But I just want to share those thoughts with you. And I hope that through kind of stepping back, listening, trying to understand, that I've taken some of the things I've learned and maybe helped you out a little bit. But I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for all you do. Take care.